Sometimes the most broken families find healing in the most unexpected places. When a desperate widow with two angry sons hires the one man everyone in town fears, she discovers that the gentlest hearts often hide behind the hardest faces. Cora Lanning was out of options. Her boys were wild with grief, her farm was falling apart, and nobody wanted to work for a poor schoolteacher. Then Wyatt Granger rode into town fresh from 10 years in prison, with calloused hands and a reputation that made mothers pull their children close. She hired him anyway. He fixed her fences, taught her boys to fish, and somehow made them laugh again. But when the town learned why he'd been locked away, they demanded she send him packing. What happens when a woman must choose between the safety everyone demands and the man who made her family whole again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards of Hollow Bend's one-room schoolhouse, where Miss Cora Lanning had spent the better part of 15 years teaching children to read, write, and mind their manners. She ran her fingers along the smooth surface of Samuel's wooden desk, the same desk her late husband had carved with his initials and polished with his own hands before gifting it to the school the year they married. The wood bore the marks of countless children's pencils, tiny scratches and dents that told stories of arithmetic lessons and carefully practiced penmanship. "Mrs. Lanning, Tommy's crying again," 8-year-old Susie Chen whispered, pointing toward the back corner where Tommy sat hunched over his slate, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Cora's heart clenched as she watched her youngest son try to disappear into himself. At 8 years old, Tommy had grown thin and pale since his father's death 18 months ago, his once bright eyes now holding shadows too deep for a child. She moved quietly to his side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What's troubling you, sweetheart?" Tommy wiped his nose with his sleeve, leaving a streak across his freckled cheek. "I can't remember what Papa's voice sounded like when he read to us," he whispered. "I try and try, but it's getting fuzzy." The admission hit Cora like a physical blow. Samuel's rich baritone had filled their small cabin every evening, bringing fairy tales and adventure stories to life for their boys. Now that voice existed only in her memory, and even she sometimes struggled to recall its exact timbre. "Your Papa's voice is still there," she said softly, kneeling beside his desk. "It's in every kind word you speak, every time you help someone smaller than you. He lives in your heart, Tommy." The boy nodded, but she could see he wasn't convinced. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that grief was like a fog that settled over the clearest memories, making everything seem distant and uncertain? The schoolhouse door creaked open, and 12-year-old Jake Lanning stomped inside, his clothes dusty from the walk and his face set in the permanent scowl he'd worn since becoming the man of the house. Where Tommy had withdrawn into silence, Jake had hardened into anger, carrying responsibilities no child should bear. "You're late, Jake," Cora said, trying to keep her voice gentle but firm. "Had to milk Bessie and check the chicken coop," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Fence is down again near the creek. Water trough's got another leak too." Cora's stomach tightened. Every repair that Samuel would have handled with ease now fell to her or Jake, and they were both failing at the task. The homestead, once Samuel's pride, was slowly crumbling around them like a house of cards in a windstorm. Jake took his seat with deliberate loudness, making the other children glance his way nervously. Since Samuel's death, Jake had appointed himself the family's protector, a role that sat uneasily on his narrow shoulders. He'd grown 3 inches in the past year, but remained all knees and elbows, fierce determination trapped in a body not yet strong enough to match his resolve. "Today we're going to practice our reading with some poetry," Cora announced, forcing brightness into her voice. "Who can tell me what makes a poem different from regular writing?" Susie's hand shot up. "It rhymes." "Sometimes it does," Cora agreed, "but poetry is really about painting pictures with words, making ordinary things seem magical." She opened her worn copy of Longfellow and began to read "The Village Blacksmith." hoping the familiar rhythm would soothe both her boys and the other children who'd grown accustomed to the tension that seemed to follow the Lanning family like a storm cloud. As the words flowed over the small classroom, Cora found herself thinking about the notice she'd posted at Henderson's general store 3 weeks ago. Written on her best stationery in careful script, it advertised for a farmhand willing to work for modest wages, very modest wages, if she was being honest. She needed someone strong enough to handle the heavy labor that was slowly defeating her family, but gentle enough not to frighten her already traumatized boys. The problem was, nobody wanted to work for a woman, especially one with 2 difficult children and a reputation for being too soft-hearted for her own good. The other widows in town, Mrs. Patterson and elderly Mrs. Kowalski, had family to help them or enough savings to hire proper help. Cora had neither. Samuel had been the town's most respected carpenter, but he'd never been much for saving money. Every extra penny had gone toward improving their small homestead or helping neighbors in need. His generosity had been one of the things she'd loved most about him, but it left her painfully unprepared for widowhood. After school ended and the children scattered like dandelion seeds in the wind, Cora walked home with Jake and Tommy through the dusty streets of Hollow Bend. The town had grown up around the railroad depot, a collection of wooden buildings and false-fronted stores that served the surrounding ranches and farms. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputations were carefully guarded and respectability mattered more than mercy. Their homestead sat on the outskirts of town, a modest house with a red barn and fenced pasture that had once looked prosperous and well-maintained. Now the paint was peeling, the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and weeds grew tall around the foundation. Samuel's workshop, where he'd crafted furniture and toys for half the families in the county, stood empty and gathering dust. "Mama, the water pump's making that funny noise again," Tommy said as they reached the front porch. Cora closed her eyes and added another item to her growing list of repairs. The pump handle needed replacing, the roof leaked during heavy rains, and the fence posts were rotting where they met the ground. Each problem felt insurmountable when she lay awake at night, listening to the house settle and creak around them. "I'll take a look at it after supper," Jake said, his voice carrying a gravity that made him sound older than his 12 years. "Jake, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." His jaw set stubbornly. "Papa would have fixed it." The comparison hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel would have fixed it, along with a dozen other things, while whistling cheerfully and teaching the boys how to use each tool properly. Samuel would have made even the most tedious chores feel like adventures. Inside their small kitchen, Cora began preparing supper with ingredients that were becoming increasingly sparse, a bit of salt pork, some beans, and vegetables from their struggling garden. She'd grown skilled at making meals appear more substantial than they actually were, a trick born of necessity rather than talent. "Mrs. Henderson was giving me funny looks today when I picked up our mail," Jake said, settling at the kitchen table where Samuel used to sit, like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Cora's hands stilled over the cast-iron skillet. Ruth Henderson was the closest thing Hollow Bend had to a social arbiter, the kind of woman who kept track of everyone's moral standing and wasn't shy about sharing her opinions. As the wife of the general store owner and the head of the school board, her disapproval could make life very difficult. "What kind of looks?" Cora asked carefully. "The kind she gets when she thinks someone's not living up to proper standards," Jake replied with surprising insight for a 12-year-old. Tommy looked up from the wooden horse he'd been turning over in his small Hansa toy Samuel had carved for him the Christmas before he died. "Are we in trouble, Mama?" "Of course not, sweetheart. Mrs. Henderson just worries about everyone in town. It's her way of caring." But even as she said the words, Cora felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. She knew exactly what Mrs. Henderson was thinking, because she'd heard the whispered conversations at church and seen the sideways glances when she walked through town. A young widow with 2 unruly boys and a failing homestead was either an object of pity or suspicion, depending on how charitable the observer felt on any given day. The truth was, she was failing at everything that mattered, As a mother, she couldn't provide the stability her boys needed. As a landowner, she couldn't maintain the property Samuel had worked so hard to build. As a teacher, she was distracted and short-tempered, her personal struggles bleeding into her professional responsibilities. After supper, while Jake attempted to fix the water pump with tools too large for his hands and Tommy practiced his letters by lamplight, Cora sat on the front porch and watched the sun sink behind the distant mountains. The evening air carried the scent of hay and dust, along with the sound of Jake's frustrated muttering as he wrestled with the stubborn pump handle. She pulled the crumpled help-wanted notice from her apron pocket and smoothed it against her knee. The paper was beginning to yellow at the edges, and she'd rewritten it twice already, each version more desperate than the last. How do you advertise for a miracle worker willing to work for almost nothing? In the gathering darkness, she allowed herself to imagine what Samuel would say if he could see them now. He'd been an optimist by nature, the kind of man who saw possibilities where others saw problems. Every ending is just a new beginning wearing work clothes, he used to say when faced with setbacks. But some endings felt too final for new beginnings. Some losses cut so deep that healing seemed impossible, especially when you were too busy surviving to properly grieve. A coyote called from somewhere across the valley, its lonesome cry echoing off the canyon walls. Tommy looked up from his letters, his eyes wide with the fear that had become his constant companion since his father's death. It's just saying goodnight to its family, Cora told him, the same explanation Samuel used to give. Even wild things need to know their loved ones are safe. She folded the notice and tucked it back into her pocket, making a silent decision. Tomorrow she'd post it again, maybe with different wording. Someone, somewhere, needed work badly enough to take a chance on a desperate widow and her broken family. Someone had to answer, because winter was coming and they couldn't survive another season of trying to hold everything together with hope and stubbornness alone. The stranger rode into Hollow Bend on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat shimmered off the dusty main street like water over stones. Cora first noticed him from the schoolhouse window during arithmetic lessons. A lone figure on horseback, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned to announce his presence slowly. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered beneath a faded work shirt, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face weathered by sun and harder things. Even from a distance, something about his posture spoke of coiled strength, held in careful check-like, a loaded gun with the safety engaged. "Mrs. Lanning, you're not listening to my multiplication," Susie Chen complained, following her teacher's gaze toward the window. "I'm sorry, dear. Please continue with the sevens table." But Cora's attention remained fixed on the stranger as he dismounted in front of Henderson's general store. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested either military training or the kind of vigilance that came from dangerous places. When he removed his hat to wipe his brow, she caught a glimpse of features carved by experience, strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. The children had noticed him too, their voices dropping to whispers as they pressed against the windows. In a town like Hollow Bend, strangers were events worth marking, especially ones who carried themselves like this man did. "He looks like a gunfighter," breathed 10-year-old Billy Morrison, his freckled face bright with excitement. "Don't be silly," Cora said automatically, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Billy's assessment wasn't entirely wrong. The stranger wore no visible weapons, but something about him suggested familiarity with violence, even if he'd put it aside. School ended an hour later, and Cora walked home with Jake and Tommy through streets buzzing with speculation. The stranger had been seen talking to Sheriff Morrison, then to Mr. Henderson, his manner courteous but distant. He'd bought supplies, basic things like coffee, beans, and tobacco, paying with coin, rather than the credit most folks used. "Think he's looking for work?" Jake asked, with the practical mind of a boy forced to grow up too quickly. "Probably just passing through," Cora replied, though something in her chest had quickened at Jake's suggestion. Men like that don't usually stay in places like this. At home, she busied herself with evening chores while keeping one ear tuned to the sounds from the barnyard where Jake was attempting to reinforce the chicken coop fence. The hammer blows came irregular and frustrated. A 12-year-old's strength simply wasn't enough for the job that needed doing. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats in the front yard. Through the fluttering sheets, she saw the stranger dismounting near her front porch, his movements unhurried and respectful. He stood beside his horsey, sturdy bay, gelding with intelligent eye sand, waited to be acknowledged, rather than approaching the house uninvited. Cora's heart began beating faster as she walked around to meet him, smoothing her apron and wishing she'd taken more care with her appearance that morning. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd seemed from the schoolhouse window. Perhaps 35 years old, with hands that showed the calluses of hard work and eyes the color of winter sky. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was quiet and carefully modulated, the kind of voice that could command attention without raising volume. "I understand you might have work available." "You saw my notice at Henderson's?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking for honest work, and I'm not particular about the wages." There was something in the way, he said, it not desperate, but resigned to circumstances that had taught him not to expect much from the world. Cora found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the character that might lie beneath the stern exterior. "I should tell you up front," she said. "The pay isn't much. Room and board in the bunkhouse, $20 a month, and whatever vegetables you can eat from the garden. The work's hard, and I've got 2 boys who aren't always easy to manage." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "I've worked for less, ma'am, and I'm comfortable around children." Before she could respond, a crash came from behind the house, followed by Jake's colorful language that would have earned him a mouthful of soap if Samuel had been alive to hear it. The stranger's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. "Jake's trying to fix the chicken coop," Cora explained, heat rising in her cheeks. "The fence posts keep pulling loose, and he's only 12, even if he thinks he's 20. Would you mind if I took a look?" She hesitated. Something about this man made her feel both safer and more vulnerable than she had in months. He radiated competence and controlled strength, but there were shadows in his eyes that spoke of experiences she couldn't begin to imagine. "I suppose that would be all right." They walked around the house together, their footsteps crunching on the dry grass. In the backyard, Jake was red-faced and sweating, wrestling with a fence post that refused to stay upright. Tommy sat on the porch steps, watching his older brothers struggle with the wide eyes of a child who'd learned to expect disappointment. "Problems?" the stranger asked Jake in a tone that somehow managed to be both respectful and helpful. Jake looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. "Post keeps coming loose. The ground's too hard, and the holes aren't deep enough, but I can't dig any deeper." The stranger knelt beside the fence, examining the problem with the focused attention of someone who understood both tools and materials. "Your holes are plenty deep," he said after a moment. "Problem is the ground's too dry, needs water to pack properly around the post." He stood and gestured toward the water trough. "Mind if I show you something?" For a moment, Jake's natural suspicion warred with his desperate need for guidance. "Need one, I guess." What followed was 15 minutes of the most practical education Jake had received since his father's death. The stranger, who introduced himself simply as Wyatt, showed him how to soak the ground around each post, how to pack the earth properly, and how to brace the fence so it could cure without sagging. "The secret," Wyatt said, demonstrating with movements that were both economical and precise, "is patience. Let the water do the work instead of fighting the ground." Jake watched with the intensity of a boy starving for exactly this kind of guidance. When the fence was finally secure, he stood back with satisfaction written across his young face. "Thanks," he said, his voice carrying a grudging respect. "You did the hard part," Wyatt replied. "Just needed a different approach." Tommy had crept closer during the lesson, drawn by the quiet competence that seemed to surround this stranger like morning calm. When Wyatt noticed the boy's attention, he didn't ignore him or talk down to him. Instead, He treated Tommy with the same respectful seriousness he'd shown Jake. "You must be Tommy," he said, crouching to the boy's level. "Your mama tells me you're 8. Tommy nodded solemnly, still clutching the wooden horse Samuel had carved for him. "That's a fine horse you've got there. Someone who knew their way around wood made that." "My papa," Tommy whispered, "before he died." The words hung in the air like smoke. Wyatt's expression didn't change, but something gentle entered his eyes, not pity, but understanding of loss that came from personal experience. "He did good work," Wyatt said simply. "A man who can carve like that sees beauty in ordinary things." It was exactly the right thing to say, and Cora felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. This stranger understood that grief required respect, not solutions. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of rose and gold, Cora found herself making a decision that would have terrified her that morning. Standing in her backyard, watching this quiet man speak to her sons with a gentleness that belied his intimidating presence, she chose to trust the instinct that had kept her family alive this long. "Mr. Wyatt," she said, and he turned to face her with those pale, careful eyes. "If you want the job, it's yours." He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and commitment. "I'll start tomorrow morning, ma'am, and it's just Wyatt." After he rode away, Cora stood in her yard, listening to the sound of Jake and Tommy talking excitedly about fence posts and proper techniques. For the first time since Samuel's death, the evening quiet felt peaceful rather than empty. She pulled his prison release papers from the pocket where he'd kept them, folded papers that spoke of 10 years, behind bars, and a past he'd been careful not to mention. But watching him with her boys, seeing the gentle strength in his weathered hands, she found herself believing that some men could carry darkness without being consumed by it. Some men perhaps were exactly what broken families needed to become whole again. Wyatt arrived at dawn the next morning, as quietly as he did everything else. Cora heard the soft sounds of him settling his horse in the barn while she prepared breakfast, the familiar rhythm of someone who understood that the early hours belonged to work, not conversation. She found him examining the water pump when she stepped onto the porch with her first cup of coffee, his large hands tracing the mechanism with the practiced touch of a man who'd learned to fix things out of necessity. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and she realized he might be closer to 40 than 35. "Coffee?" she offered, holding up the pot. "Much obliged," he said, straightening. When she handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed briefly his skin, rough with calluses, but surprisingly gentle. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the distant mountains gold. It felt natural having another adult presence in the morning quiet, someone who understood that dawn was for listening rather than talking. "Boys still sleeping?" he asked. "Jake will be up soon. He likes to check on the animals before school. Tommy's harder to wake. He's always been my dreamer." Wyatt nodded, sipping his coffee. Dreamers need protecting in a world like this. There was something in his voice that made her study his profile, wondering what had taught him that particular truth. But before she could ask, Jake emerged from the house, hair sticking up and eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," he mumbled, then stopped short when he saw Wyatt. "Oh, you came back." "Said I would," Wyatt replied simply. Jake considered this, then nodded with the gravity of someone testing whether adults could be trusted to keep their word. "Guess you want to see what else needs fixing. If you don't mind showing me around." What followed was Jake's tour of the homestead's accumulated problemsa catalogue of broken, loose, and failing things that would have overwhelmed any single person trying to manage them alone. Wyatt listened without comment, occasionally asking practical questions about how long something had been problematic or what Samuel's original approach had been. "Papa always said the barn roof would need new shingles before winter," Jake said as they stood looking up at the weathered wood. "But then he got sick, and—" his voice trailed off. "We'll get it done," Wyatt said quietly. "Your papa built good bones here, just needs some attention." After Jake left for school with Tommy trailing reluctantly behind, Wyatt set to work with the methodical efficiency of someone who approached problems systematically rather than frantically. Cora watched from the schoolhouse window during her lunch break, noting how he seemed to prioritize repairs by both urgency and logic, fixing the water pump first, then moving to the fence line that kept their few head of cattle from wandering. When she arrived home that afternoon, she found him in Samuel's workshop, carefully organizing tools that had been gathering dust since her husband's death. The sight stopped her cold. This space had been Samuel's sanctuary, the place where he'd created beautiful things and taught the boys to work with their hands. "I hope you don't mind," Wyatt said, noticing her hesitation. "Thought the tools should be cared for. A man's tools tell you something about who he was." He held up a hand plane, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. "Whoever owned this took pride in his work. These are quality tools, well maintained." Cora's throat tightened. "Samuel did beautiful work. Furniture, toys for the children, anything the house needed. He said good tools deserved respect." He was right. Wyatt set the plane carefully back in its place. "Would it be all right if I use them? I'll treat them proper." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Somehow, seeing Samuel's tools in capable hands again felt like a benediction rather than a betrayal. That evening, Jake burst through the front door with unusual energy. "Mama!" Wyatt fixed the water pump and started on the barn roof and organized all of Papa's tools, and Mrs. Chen said her husband might have extra shingles he'd sell cheap because their roof project got delayed. The transformation in her son was startling. For the first time since Samuel's death, Jake seemed excited about something other than his own growing responsibilities. Having another man around, someone competent and reliable, was lifting a burden from shoulders too young to carry it. "And look what he showed me," Jake continued, pulling a piece of rope from his pocket. "It's called a bowline knot. See, it makes a loop that won't slip, but you can still untie it easy." Tommy appeared at his brother's elbow, drawn by the enthusiasm. "Show me," he said softly. For the next 20 minutes, Jake taught his younger brother the knot, while Cora prepared supper, their voices animated in a way she hadn't heard since their father's death. When Wyatt appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand, she invited him to join them. "Much obliged, but I don't want to impose on family time," he said. "You're not imposing," Jake said quickly. "You should eat with us. We've got plenty." It wasn't true. They had exactly enough, and no more, but Cora found herself nodding agreement. "Please, it's the least I can do." Over a simple meal of cornbread, beans, and vegetables from their garden, she watched Wyatt interact with her sons. He listened when they talked, asked thoughtful questions, and somehow managed to treat Jake like the almost man he wanted to be, while still protecting Tommy's childhood innocence. "Wyatt, where did you learn to do so many different things?" Tommy asked, his natural curiosity overcoming his usual shyness. A shadow passed over Wyatt's face, so quickly she might have imagined it. "Here and there," he said carefully. "A man picks up skills when he needs them." Jake frowned, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but Wyatt smoothly changed the subject to the next day's work plans. Still, Cora noticed how he avoided any details about his past, keeping his answers general and deflecting personal questions with the skill of someone who'd had practice. After supper, she found herself washing dishes while listening to the sound of Wyatt teaching the boys how to properly coil rope in the barn. Their laughter drifted through the open window, and she realized how long it had been since she'd heard that particular sound, the easy, comfortable laughter of children who felt safe enough to simply be children. Later, after Jake and Tommy had gone to bed, she stepped onto the porch and saw Wyatt sitting on the bunkhouse steps, smoking a cigarette in the gathering darkness. The ember glowed red in the shadows, and she could make out his silhouette against the lamplight from the window. Something about his posture spoke of solitude that went deeper than simply being alone. This was a man accustomed to his own company, who'd learned to find peace in quiet moments because louder ones had been dangerous. She thought about approaching him, maybe asking some of the questions that had been building in her mind all day. Where had he learned to fix things so skillfully? Why was he willing to work for so little? What shadows had carved those lines around his eyes? But something held her back, perhaps the recognition that everyone deserved their private pain, their untold stories. Instead, she simply stood in her doorway, listening to the evening sounds of a homestead that felt more stable than it had in 18 months. Inside the house, she found Jake's broken fishing rod, where he'd left it on the kitchen table, its two pieces still held together by a few stubborn fibers. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd ask Wyatt if it could be mended. Some broken things, she was beginning to hope, might still be salvageable. The carved wooden horse appeared on Tommy's nightstand 3 days later, small enough to fit in a child's palm but perfectly detailed. Every line spoke of patient craftsmanship, the flowing mane, the alert ears, the proud arch of the neck. It was the kind of gift that said more about the giver than any words could express. "Wyatt made this for me," Tommy announced at breakfast, his voice bright with wonder as he showed the horse to Jake and Cora. "He said every boy should have something special that's just his." Cora examined the little figure, noting the care that had gone into each detail. The wood had been sanded smooth as silk and finished with oil that brought out the natural grain. This was the work of someone who understood that children treasured beauty as much as adults did, maybe more. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, handing it back to Tommy, who immediately began making soft, galloping sounds as he moved the horse across the table. Jake watched his younger brother with an expression that mixed envy and approval. At 12, he was caught between wanting such gifts himself and feeling too old to admit it. Wyatt seemed to understand this delicate balance, because later that morning he approached Jake with a different kind of offering. "Been thinking about that fishing rod of yours," Wyatt said as Jake prepared to leave for school. "Might be fixable if you're interested in learning how." Jake's eyes lit up. The rod had been Samuel's, passed down when Jake turned 10, and its breaking had felt like losing another piece of his father. "You think it can really be fixed?" "Won't know until we try. Take some patience, though. Good repairs can't be rushed." That afternoon, Cora returned from school to find them in Samuel's workshop, the broken rod laid out on the workbench, like a patient on an operating table. Wyatt was showing Jake how to examine the break, explaining the wood's grain and how stress traveled through different types of breaks. "See here," Wyatt pointed to the splintered end. "This is what we call a spiral fracture, means the wood twisted as it broke. We'll need to realign the grain carefully, then reinforce it with something stronger than the original." "What's stronger than ash wood?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. "Nothing really, but we can add strength by wrapping it with sinew and binding it with silk thread. The trick is making the repair part of the rod's structure instead of just patching it up." Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, playing quietly with his wooden horse while listening to every word. Cora leaned against the doorframe, watching the three of them work together with growing amazement. Wyatt had a gift for teaching that went beyond simple instruction. He made Jake feel capable and important, while drawing Tommy into the lesson without making him feel excluded. "Why silk thread instead of regular thread?" Jake asked, carefully following Wyatt's demonstration of how to wrap the break. "Silk's stronger when it's wet, and it shrinks as it dries, creates a binding that gets tighter over time instead of looser." "Where'd you learn all this stuff?" Again, that brief shadow crossed Wyatt's face. "Man I knew once was good with his hands. Taught me that broken things usually want to be whole again. You just have to listen to what they need." It was another non-answer, but Jake seemed satisfied. He was too focused on the delicate work of restoration to push for details about Wyatt's mysterious past. Under Wyatt's patient guidance, Jake's young hands performed the intricate repair with growing confidence. "There," Wyatt said finally, examining their work. "Now it needs to cure for a few days before we test it. Healing takes time." That evening, while Jake proudly showed his mother the restored fishing rod and Tommy made elaborate adventures for his wooden horse, Cora found herself studying Wyatt across the supper table. There was something almost therapeutic about watching him with her boys, the way he listened to their stories, answered their questions, and somehow managed to fill the father-shaped hole in their lives without trying to replace Samuel. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by the schoolhouse today," she mentioned casually, testing the waters of town opinion. "Asked about our new hired help." Wyatt's fork paused halfway to his mouth, but his expression remained neutral. "What did you tell her?" "That you're exactly what we needed, competent, reliable, and good with the boys." "And what did she say to that?" Cora hesitated, remembering Mrs. Patterson's pinched expression and carefully worded concerns. "She wondered where you'd come from, what your references were. You know how people worry in small towns." Jake looked up sharply. "What's there to worry about? Wyatt fixed more stuff in 3 days than we managed in 3 months. Some folks need time to get comfortable with new faces," Wyatt said mildly. "It's natural to be cautious." But Cora caught the tension in his shoulders, the careful neutrality that suggested he'd dealt with suspicious communities before. She wondered what it cost him to remain so patient in the face of judgment he hadn't earned. The next morning brought their first real test of the arrangement. Cora woke to the sound of commotion in the barnyard. Their bull, a cantankerous animal named Brutus, had broken through the fence during the night and was now terrorizing the chickens while evading all attempts at capture. Jake stood at the edge of the barnyard, rope in hand, but clearly afraid to get too close to the massive animal. Tommy watched from the safety of the porch, eyes wide with excitement and fear. "Should I get Sheriff Morrison?" Jake called to his mother, frustration evident in his voice. Before Cora could answer, Wyatt appeared from the barn, moving with calm deliberation toward the agitated bull. He carried no rope, no prod, nothing but quiet confidence and understanding of how frightened animals behaved. "Easy, big fellow," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, approaching Brutus from an angle that didn't seem threatening. "Nobody's going to hurt you." What happened next seemed almost magical to the watching family. Wyatt simply stood still, talking softly to the bull, until the animal's defensive posturing gradually relaxed. Then, with movements so subtle they were barely visible, he began guiding Brutus toward the barn, using nothing but body language and infinite patience. "How did he do that?" Tommy breathed, awed. "He made Brutus feel safe instead of trapped," Jake said, watching with new respect as Wyatt calmly led the bull back to his proper enclosure. When Wyatt returned to the house, Cora had coffee waiting and breakfast on the table. "That was impressive," she said. "Bulls are like people," he replied, settling into what was becoming his usual chair. "They get scared and act out when they feel cornered. Show them respect, give them room to save face, and most times they'll cooperate." It was such a simple philosophy, but Cora recognized the wisdom in it. She thought about Jake's anger, Tommy's withdrawal, her own defensive responses to the community's judgment. Maybe what they all needed was someone who understood how to create safety instead of demand compliance. After breakfast, as she prepared for another day of teaching, Cora found herself humming for the first time since Samuel's death. The sound surprised her. She'd thought that kind of easy happiness was gone forever. Outside, she could hear Wyatt explaining to the boys how to properly reinforce the fence to prevent future bull escapes, his voice patient and instructive. Tommy's laughter rang out as he apparently attempted some task beyond his capabilities, followed by Wyatt's gentle encouragement to try again. The wooden horse sat on the kitchen windowsill, catching the morning light. Such a small thing, carved from scraps in quiet evening hours, but it represented something larger, the possibility that broken families could indeed find healing in unexpected places, one careful repair at a time. 2 weeks into Wyatt's employment, Cora caught herself twisting Samuel's wedding ring around her finger while watching him teach Jake how to split wood properly. The unconscious gesture had become more frequent lately, as if her hands needed to remind her heart of loyalties that her mind was beginning to question. "Keep your stance wider," Wyatt was saying, demonstrating the proper swing technique. "Let the axe do the work, you're just guiding it where it needs to go." Jake nodded seriously, then attempted to copy the movement. His first try sent the axe head into the chopping block at an awkward angle, nowhere near the wood he'd intended to split. Better, Wyatt said, without a trace of mockery. Your aim was true. Just need to trust the weight of the tool. Cora marveled at his patience. Samuel had been a good teacher too, but he'd had the advantage of watching his sons grow from babies into boys. Wyatt was learning their personalities and capabilities on the fly, yet somehow he always seemed to know exactly what each child needed to hear. Wyatt, Jake's voice carried the careful tone of a boy approaching a sensitive subject. Could you teach me how to fight? Wyatt's hands stilled on the axe handle. What kind of fighting you thinking about? Fair fighting, you know, with fists. Billy Morrison's been saying things about us, about how we can't take care of ourselves without Papa. He pushed Tommy yesterday, called him a crybaby. Cora's maternal instincts flared, but she forced herself to remain quiet and listen. This was exactly the kind of situation Samuel would have handled, and she had no idea what the right response should be. Fighting's serious business, Wyatt said finally. Once you raise your fists, you can't take back what happens next. You sure talking won't solve this problem? I tried talking. Billy just laughed and said Tommy was too weak to stand up for himself, and I was too small to make him stop. Wyatt considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. All right. But if I teach you, we do it my way. You learn control first, anger last. And you promise me you'll only use it to protect someone who can't protect themselves. I promise. Tommy, too, can't have one brother knowing something the other doesn't. Tommy, who'd been listening from the porch steps, perked up with interest. Really? You'd teach me too? Strength isn't about size, Wyatt told him. It's about knowing what you're capable of and having the discipline to use it right. That afternoon, Cora watched from the kitchen window as Wyatt began what he called lessons in standing ground. He started with stance and balance, showing both boys how to plant their feet and keep their center of gravity low. Then came basic blocking techniques, not how to throw punches, but how to protect themselves from incoming ones. Fighting's mostly about not getting hit, he explained. If someone can't hurt you, they usually get tired of trying. What if they don't get tired? Jake asked. Then you end it quick and clean, with no more force than necessary. Wyatt's voice carried a weight that made both boys pay close attention. Violence should always be the last choice, but when it's the only choice, you make sure it's effective. There was something in the way he said it that made Cora wonder about the experiences that had taught him such lessons. His movements were too precise, too automatic to have been learned in schoolyard scuffles or friendly sparring matches. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed full of excited chatter about proper defensive stances, Cora found herself alone with Wyatt on the front porch. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine of sharing coffee in the evening, quiet, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. Thank you, she said finally, for handling that situation with Jake. I wouldn't have known what to tell him. Boys need to know they can protect what matters to them, Wyatt replied. Confidence comes from competence. Samuel used to say something similar. She paused, then added carefully, he would have liked you. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than she'd intended. Wyatt's profile was silhouetted against the lamplight from the window, strong and somehow reassuring in the darkness. He sounds like he was a good man, Wyatt said quietly. He was, gentle but strong, you know. The kind of man who could split wood all morning and then spend the afternoon teaching Tommy how to read. She twisted the ring again, feeling its familiar weight. Some days I can barely remember his voice. Other days I can hear it so clearly, it's like he's standing right behind me. Grief's strange that way, comes and goes like weather. There was understanding in his voice that suggested personal experience with loss. She wanted to ask about it, but something held her back, the same instinct that warned her not to pry too deeply into the shadows that sometimes crossed his features. The boys are different since you've been here, she said instead. Happier. Jake's not carrying the whole world on his shoulders anymore, and Tommy's starting to laugh again. They're good boys, just needed someone to believe in them. And me? The question slipped out before she could stop it, more vulnerable than she'd intended. Wyatt turned to look at her directly, his pale eyes serious. You're raising two fine sons under circumstances that would break most people. Takes real strength to do what you're doing." The simple validation nearly brought tears to her eyes. For months, she'd felt like she was failing at everything that mattered: a mother, as a provider, as the keeper of Samuel's memory. To hear someone she respected tell her she was strong enough felt like finding water in the desert. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice," she admitted. "Hiring you, I mean. People talk." "What kind of talk?" "The careful kind. Questions about where you came from, what your intentions might be. Mrs. Henderson asked me yesterday if I'd checked your references." Wyatt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd checked what mattered: your character, your work ethic, your treatment of my children. The rest was none of her business." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Bet that went over well." "About as well as you'd expect. She reminded me that, as a school teacher, I represent certain standards in the community. That people are watching to see if I'm setting a proper example for their children." The unspoken implication hung in the air between them that a widow, taking in a mysterious stranger, might be seen as improper, even scandalous, regardless of the innocent reality. "If my being here causes problems for you," Wyatt began. "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "You're not the problem. Fear is the problem. People would rather cling to their suspicions than admit they might be wrong about someone." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the community's judgment settling around them like evening mist. Cora found herself thinking about the choices ahead, whether to bow to social pressure or trust her own instincts about this man who'd brought such peace to her fractured family. Inside the house, she could hear the soft sounds of her boys, sleeping soundly for the first time in months. Tommy's nightmares had all but disappeared, and Jake's angry restlessness had given way to the deep sleep of a child who no longer felt responsible for holding the world together. Whatever the cost of keeping Wyatt here, she thought, it couldn't be higher than the price of sending him away. Sheriff Morrison found the wanted poster while searching through his predecessor's files for an unrelated case, buried beneath years of accumulated paperwork in a cabinet that rarely saw daylight. The yellow document made him sit back in his chair and study the faded photograph more carefully. The man in the picture was younger, clean-shaven, with eyes that held a different kind of wariness than the quiet stranger who'd been working at the Lanning homestead for the past month. But the bone structure was unmistakable, the set of the shoulders, the way he held his head. Sheriff Morrison had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize a man, even when time and hard experience had changed him. "Wyatt Granger," he read aloud from the poster, "wanted for the murder of Marcus Whitfield, armed and extremely dangerous." The date on the poster was 11 years old. The crime had taken place in a town called Cedar Ridge, 300 miles south, in circumstances the brief description didn't fully explain. What it did make clear was that Wyatt Granger had killed a man and disappeared before trial. Morrison leaned back in his chair, conflicted. He'd been watching the situation at the Lanning place with quiet approval, noting how the boys had straightened up, how Cora had started smiling again, how the homestead was finally getting the care it desperately needed. Whatever Wyatt Granger had done 11 years ago, he was clearly a different man now. But the law was the law, and Morrison had sworn an oath to uphold it, regardless of personal feelings. He locked the poster in his desk drawer and spent the rest of the day wrestling with his conscience. By evening, he'd made his decision: he would confront Wyatt directly, give the man a chance to explain before taking any official action. It was more courtesy than the wanted poster suggested Granger deserved, but it was the kind of fairness Morrison believed in. Meanwhile, at the Lanning homestead, Wyatt was teaching the boys how to fish in the creek that ran along the eastern edge of their property. Jake had been skeptical when Wyatt suggested they try the deeper pools near the old oak grove, insisting that he and his father had fished there many times without success. "Water's different now," Wyatt explained, studying the current with experienced eyes. "Spring runoff changed the flow patterns. Sometimes what didn't work before works now." He showed them how to read the water where the current slowed, where insects gathered, where fish were likely to wait for easy meals. His knowledge was thorough and practical, the kind that came from spending long hours observing natural patterns. "How do you know so much about fishing?" Tommy asked, carefully casting his line as Wyatt had taught him. "Man learns what he needs to survive," Wyatt replied, his standard non-answer that revealed nothing while explaining everything. Jake was growing frustrated with these evasions. At 12, he was old enough to sense that adults sometimes kept important secrets, and Wyatt's careful deflections were beginning to feel deliberate rather than modest. "Where did you live before you came here?" Jake pressed. "What kind of work did you do?" Wyatt's hands stilled on his fishing line. "Different places, different kinds of work. That's not really an answer." "Jake!" Cora called from the bank where she sat watching them, her voice carrying a gentle warning. "It's all right," Wyatt said quietly. He met Jake's eyes directly, his expression serious. "You're right, it's not really an answer. Truth is, there are parts of my past that aren't fit for young ears. Someday, when you're older, maybe we can talk about it proper. For now, I hope it's enough that I'm here, doing right by your family." There was such honest regret in his voice that Jake's combative posture softened. "Are you in some kind of trouble? Is that why you can't talk about it?" "The kind of trouble that follows a man whether he deserves it or not," Wyatt admitted. "But nothing that should touch you or your mama or Tommy. I give you my word on that." It was the most direct acknowledgement of his mysterious past that he'd ever offered, and somehow it satisfied Jake more than evasive answers had. The boy nodded and returned his attention to fishing, apparently deciding that Wyatt's actions mattered more than his history. They caught 3 good-sized trout that afternoon, enough for a proper supper. Walking back to the house in the golden light of late afternoon, Tommy chattering excitedly about his first successful catch, Cora found herself thinking about trust and the different forms it could take. She trusted Wyatt, with her children, with her home, with the daily intimacies of family life. She trusted his gentleness, his competence, his quiet integrity. But she also sensed that there were depths to him she didn't understand, experiences that had shaped him in ways she might never fully comprehend. That evening, after a supper of fresh trout and cornbread, after Jake and Tommy had been tucked into bed with stories of their fishing triumph, Cora and Wyatt found themselves alone on the porch again. The ritual had become precious to her, these quiet moments when the day's work was done, and they could simply exist in each other's company. "The boys adore you," she said, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance across the meadow. "They're easy to care about. It's more than that, though. You understand them in a way that—" She paused, struggling to articulate something she'd been feeling but hadn't named. "You know how to be what they need without trying to replace what they've lost." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his profile thoughtful in the lamplight. "Lost my own father when I was about Jake's age," he said finally. "Know what it feels like to have the ground disappear under your feet." It was the first truly personal thing he'd shared, and Cora felt the weight of the confidence he was placing in her. What happened to him? Accident. Farming accident. One minute he was there, teaching me how to harness the plow team. Next minute he was gone, and I was supposed to be the man of the house. His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. Made a lot of mistakes trying to fill shoes that were too big for me. "Is that what brought you here? Looking for a chance to do better?" He turned to look at her, his pale eyes serious in the darkness. "Maybe. Or maybe I was just lucky enough to find a family that needed what I had to offer." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them was quite ready to examine too closely. Cora felt her heart beating faster, recognizing the dangerous territory they were approaching, the place where gratitude and attraction began to blur into something more complicated. "Cora," he said quietly, and the sound of her given name in his voice made her breath catch. "I need you to know that whatever happens, whatever you might hear about me, my intentions toward you and the boys are honorable. You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again, a chance to be useful, to matter to people who matter." The gravity in his voice frightened her, almost as much as it comforted her. "What do you think I might hear?" In a town this size, secrets don't stay buried long. When the truth comes out, and it will, I want you to remember this conversation. Remember that some men can carry darkness without being consumed by it. Before she could ask what he meant, he stood and touched the brim of his hat in his usual polite gesture. "Good night, Cora. Thank you for the fishing and the supper and everything." She watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, his words echoing in her mind. Whatever shadows from his past were catching up to him, she realized. He was trying to prepare her for them. The question was whether she was brave enough to face whatever truth was coming, and whether her feelings for this enigmatic man were strong enough to survive it. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the Lanning homestead just after dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the valley floor and the world felt hushed with possibility. He found Wyatt in the barn, mucking stalls with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything he did. "Mr. Granger," Morrison said quietly, and something in his tone made Wyatt straighten slowly, his hands still gripping the pitchfork. "Sheriff." Wyatt's voice was calm, but his eyes had taken on the watchful quality of a man who'd been expecting this moment for a long time. Morrison pulled the faded wanted poster from his jacket pocket and held it up. "Found this in my predecessor's files yesterday. Care to explain?" Wyatt looked at the poster for a long moment, his weathered face showing no surprise, only resignation. Wondered when that would surface. Sheriff Hawkins was thorough about sharing information between jurisdictions. "Says here you murdered a man named Marcus Whitfield in Cedar Ridge 11 years ago. Says you're armed and dangerous." "Says a lot of things," Wyatt replied quietly. "Not all of them true." Morrison studied the man before him, the same man who'd been gently teaching two grieving boys how to fish just yesterday, who'd never shown even a hint of violence despite obvious capability for it. "Why don't you tell me what really happened?" Wyatt set the pitchfork aside and leaned against the stall door, his movements careful and non-threatening. "You going to arrest me either way? Depends on what you have to say." Wyatt was quiet for so long that Morrison thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a story that had been locked away for too many years. "I was working a ranch outside Cedar Ridge. Place owned by a man named Robert Whitfield. Marcus was his son. Rich family, influential, the kind that thought money meant they could do whatever they pleased." He paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult to form. Marcus had a taste for young girls, real young. His father knew about it, covered for him, paid off families to keep quiet. Everyone in town knew, but nobody dared cross the Whitfields. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. He'd investigated enough crimes against children to know where this story was heading. "There was a girl," Wyatt continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lucy Chensher was maybe 10 years old. Her family worked as servants at the Whitfield house. Marcus cornered her in the barn one afternoon while her parents were in town." The name Chen hit Morrison like a physical blow. "Any relation to the Chen family here in Hollow Bend?" "Lucy's older sister, May. She married Ben Chen after the family moved here, trying to get away from what happened." Wyatt's eyes met Morrison's directly. "Lucy didn't survive what Marcus did to her." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Morrison had to take a deep breath before he could continue. "And you found them?" "Heard her screaming from across the property. By the time I got there," Wyatt's voice broke slightly, then steadied. "By the time I got there, she was already gone. Marcus was still hurting her, even after she died." Morrison closed his eyes, fighting the nausea that rose in his throat. "What did you do?" "What any decent man would do. I stopped him." "The poster says you shot him." "Yes." "In the back?" Wyatt's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "That's what they claimed. Truth is, Marcus reached for his gun when he saw me. We struggled. His gun went off. Bullet went through his chest. But by the time his father and the sheriff arrived, they'd arranged things to look different." "Why didn't you stay and fight the charges? If it was self-defense?" "Because Robert Whitfield owned the sheriff, the judge, and half the jury pool. Because I was nobody special, and they were the most powerful family in 3 counties. because they needed someone to blame for Marcus's death that wasn't Marcus himself. Morrison understood. He'd seen enough corruption in small towns to know how justice could be bought and sold, like any other commodity. So you ran. Spent 10 years in prison anyway, Wyatt said quietly. Different crime, different jurisdiction. But at least that time I was guilty of what they charged me with. What crime? Beat a man nearly to death for touching a child that wasn't his. Turned out the man was the son of another prominent family. Turned out my reputation for violence against upstanding citizens had preceded me. The irony was, bitter Wyatt had been imprisoned for the very thing that proved his character, his inability to stand by, while innocents suffered. Got out 6 months ago, Wyatt continued. Been trying to find a place where I could live quiet, do honest work, maybe find some peace. Thought I'd found it here. Morrison looked at the wanted poster again, seeing it now with different eyes. This poster's 11 years old. Statute of limitations has run out on anything except murder. And if I didn't commit murder, then you're free to go about your business. Morrison folded the poster and put it back in his pocket. But there's going to be questions. People are going to want answers. What are you going to tell them? Morrison considered this carefully. As sheriff, he had a duty to uphold the law. But he also had a duty to protect the innocent, and everything he'd observed suggested that Wyatt Granger was many things, but dangerous to good people wasn't one of them. I'm going to do some investigating, he said finally. Send some telegrams to Cedar Ridge, see what I can learn about the original case. In the meantime, you're free to continue working here, but I'd advise you to stay close to home. And Wyatt? Yes, sir? If this story checks out the way I think it will, you've got nothing to worry about from me. But if you're lying, if you really did murder that man in cold blood, I'll see you hang for it. Wyatt nodded solemnly. That's fair. After Morrison left, Wyatt stood in the barn for a long time, listening to the sounds of the awakening homestead. He could hear Cora in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Jake and Tommy's voices drifted from the house, bright with the anticipation of another day. He thought about the blood-stained child's dress that had been evidence in Marcus Whitfield's death, the dress Lucy Chen had been wearing when she died, the dress that had told the true story of what happened in that barn. He wondered if it still existed somewhere, locked away in an evidence room, silent testimony to a truth that powerful men had worked hard to bury. When he finally emerged from the barn, Cora was hanging laundry on the line, humming softly to herself. She looked up as he approached, and her smile faltered when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "Sheriff Morrison paid me a visit this morning." The color drained from her face. "Are you in trouble?" "Maybe. Depends on what he finds when he starts asking questions about my past." Cora set down her laundry basket and stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face. "Tell me what happened. All of it." So he did. Standing in the morning sunlight with the scent of soap and clean clothes around them, he told her about Lucy Chen and Marcus Whitfield and the choice he'd made in a barn 11 years ago. He told her about the corruption that had forced him to run, the prison time that had followed, and the long road that had led him to her doorstep. When he finished, Cora was quiet for a long time, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold something together. "Lucy Chen," she said finally, "May's little sister. You knew." "I knew something terrible had happened to their family before they came here. May never talked about it, but sometimes I'd catch her watching her own daughters with a kind of fear that went bone deep." Cora looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You tried to save her. I was too late. But you tried, and you made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else." The simple acceptance in her voice nearly broke him. He'd expected condemnation, fear, the kind of judgment that had followed him for 11 years. Instead, she was offering him something he'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of being understood. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know. Morrison seems like a fair man, but once word gets out, and it will, the town's going to have opinions. You might want to consider whether keeping me on is worth the trouble it's going to cause." Cora straightened, and for a moment he saw steel beneath her gentle exterior. "Let me worry about the town. The question is, do you want to stay?" "More than anything," he said quietly. Then we'll face whatever comes together. The emergency school board meeting was called for Thursday evening, 3 days after Sheriff Morrison's telegrams to Cedar Ridge had confirmed Wyatt's story, and word had spread through Hollow Bend like wildfire through dry grass. Mrs. Henderson had wasted no time organizing what she called a proper response to this situation, and the formal letter demanding action arrived at Cora's door on Wednesday morning. She read it twice, her hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. The letter was coldly professional, typed on official school district letterhead, but its message was unmistakable. Dismiss Wyatt Granger immediately, or face termination from her teaching position. "What's that, Mama?" Tommy asked, looking up from his breakfast with the innocent curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some pieces of paper could destroy entire worlds. "Nothing important, sweetheart," she lied, folding the letter and slipping it into her apron pocket. "Finish your eggs." But Jake, now 13 and sharp-eyed with premature wisdom, watched her face carefully. "It's about Wyatt, isn't it? About what people are saying." "What are people saying?" Tommy asked, his voice taking on the worried tone that had become too familiar since his father's death. "Nothing you need to worry about," Cora said firmly, though her heart was breaking for the fear she could see creeping back into her youngest son's eyes. The past 3 days had been a masterclass in how quickly a small town could turn. Friends who'd greeted her warmly for 15 years now offered stiff nods or crossed the street entirely. Parents who'd trusted her with their children's education whispered among themselves when she passed. Even the merchant transactions that were part of daily life had taken on an awkward formality. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very people demanding Wyatt's removal were the same ones who'd watched her struggle alone for 18 months without offering meaningful help. Now that she'd found someone capable of providing what her family needed, they wanted to take him away in the name of protecting her reputation. After school that day, she found Wyatt in Samuel's workshop, methodically sharpening tools with the focused attention he brought to every task. He looked up when she entered, and she saw in his eyes that he already knew about the meeting. "Morrison told you," she said. "Warned me would be more accurate. Said the board's planning to give you an ultimatum, him or your job." Cora sank onto the old stool Samuel had used when working on delicate projects, suddenly feeling every one of her 32 years. "They're not wrong about one thing. I do need this job. It's the only steady income we have. I know. But they're wrong about everything else. They're wrong about you, wrong about what's best for my boys, wrong about what kind of woman they think I should be." Wyatt set down the chisel he'd been sharpening and gave her his full attention. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that losing my job would be hard, but losing you would be harder, for me and especially for Jake and Tommy." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either had expected. They were approaching territory that had been carefully avoided for weeks, the growing awareness that what existed between them had moved beyond simple employer and employee. "Cora," he said quietly, "you can't sacrifice your future for me. These boys need stability, security, things I can't provide. What they need is to feel safe and loved and valued. You've given them that in ways I couldn't manage alone." She stood and moved closer to the workbench, running her fingers along the smooth wood that Samuel's hands had once shaped. "Samuel would want them to have that. He'd want me to have it too. And if the whole town turns against you, if they make it impossible for you to live here, then maybe it's time to consider whether this is the right place for us anyway." The suggestion was radical, unprecedented. Cora had lived in Hollow Bend her entire life, had expected to raise her children here and eventually be buried in the cemetery beside Samuel. But looking at Wyatt now, seeing the quiet strength that had become her anchor, she found herself imagining different possibilities. "Where would we go?" he asked, and she noticed he said, "we" rather than "you." "I don't know. Somewhere that judges people by their actions instead of their past. Somewhere that understands the difference between reputation and character." That evening, after supper, Cora called Jake and Tommy into the parlor for a conversation she'd been dreading. They deserved to know what was happening, to understand the choice she was facing and why it mattered. "Boys, we need to talk about something important," she began, settling into Samuel's old chair while they arranged themselves on the rug at her feet, a configuration that reminded her painfully of the bedtime stories their father used to tell. "It's about Wyatt, isn't it?" Jake said immediately. "About why Mrs. Henderson was giving us dirty looks at the store today, and why Billy Morrison's father told him to stay away from us." Tommy's eyes widened. "Stay away from us? Why?" Cora took a deep breath and explained, as gently as possible, about Wyatt's past and the town's reaction to learning about it. She told them about the choice she was facing, the ultimatum from the school board, and the possibility that they might need to leave Hollow Bend if they wanted to stay together as a family. "But Wyatt saved that little girl," Tommy said when she finished, his voice indignant with the moral clarity that only children possessed. "He was trying to help her." "That's right, sweetheart. But some people think that because he killed someone, even to protect a child, he's dangerous to be around." Jake's face was flushed with anger. "That's stupid. Wyatt's the best man I know besides Papa. He fixed everything that was broken, taught us important stuff, made us feel like we could handle anything." "I know," Cora said softly, "but other people don't know him the way we do." "Then they should learn," Tommy declared with the fierce loyalty of a child who'd found safety in unexpected places. "What are you going to do, Mama?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that adult decisions had consequences for everyone. "I'm going to do what I think is right for our family," she said, "even if it's hard, even if other people don't understand." The next morning brought another development that changed everything. Mei Chen appeared at Cora's kitchen door just after breakfast, her usually composed face streaked with tears and her hands shaking. "Mrs. Lanning, I need to speak with you," she said in heavily accented English that trembled with emotion. "About Mr. Wyatt, about my sister." Cora invited her in, settling her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, while Jake and Tommy watched from the doorway with wide, curious eyes. "Sheriff Morrison came to see me yesterday," May said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He told me about what happened in Cedar Ridge, about what Mr. Wyatt tried to do for Lucy." Cora reached across the table and took the other woman's hands in hers. "I'm so sorry for your loss, May. I can't imagine." "No one tried to help her before," May interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "No one stood up to the Whitfield family. They had money, power." Everyone was afraid. She looked up at Cora with eyes that blazed with old grief and new determination. "Mr. Wyatt tried to save my baby sister. He tried to stop the monster who killed her." "Yes," Cora said simply. "The town, they want to punish him for this. They want to drive away the only man who had courage to fight for an innocent child. Some people are afraid." "Then they are fools," May said with surprising vehemence, "and I will tell them so." She stood abruptly, her tea forgotten. "They will be meeting tonight, yes? About Mr. Wyatt?" "Yes, but May, you don't have to." "I will be there. I will tell them about my sister, about what happened to her, about why Mr. Wyatt deserves honor, not shame." After May left, Cora found herself thinking about courage and the different forms it could take. There was the obvious kind, the courage that had driven Wyatt to intervene when he found Marcus Whitfield with Lucy Chen. But there was also the quieter kind, the courage to stand by someone when the rest of the world turned away, the courage to choose love over fear, the courage to believe that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. That afternoon, she sat down at her kitchen table and wrote her own letter, not to the school board, but to the entire community. It was a letter about justice and mercy, about the difference between a man's worst moment and his truest character, about the kind of community she wanted her sons to grow up in. She delivered copies to Henderson's General Store, the post office, and the church bulletin board, knowing that by evening everyone in Hollow Bend would have read her words or heard them repeated. As the sun set and the time for the meeting approached, Cora dressed carefully in her best dress and pinned her hair with the silver combs Samuel had given her for their 5th anniversary. She was preparing for what might be the most important battle of her life, and she wanted to look like a woman worthy of the fight. Jake and Tommy stood in the doorway watching her, their young faces solemn with understanding. "Are you scared, Mama?" Tommy asked. A little, she admitted, but sometimes being scared means you're doing something that matters. We believe in you, Jake said with the gravity of someone offering a sacred trust. And we believe in Wyatt, too. As she walked toward the schoolhouse where the meeting would be held, Cora carried their faith with her like armor, knowing that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her family's future, but the kind of woman she wanted to be. The schoolhouse was packed beyond capacity when Cora arrived, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. The air was thick with tension and competing perfumes, the smell of nervous perspiration and righteousness in equal measure. Mrs. Henderson sat at the teacher's desk, like a judge preparing to render verdict, flanked by the other school board members, who looked decidedly uncomfortable with the attention their emergency meeting had attracted. Cora took a seat in the front row, her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap with deceptive calm. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations of people who'd known her entire life, their voices carrying everything from sympathy to condemnation. "Call to order," Mrs. Henderson announced, rapping her knuckles on the desk with unnecessary force. "We're here tonight to address a serious matter concerning the employment of Mrs. Lanning and her association with a known criminal." "Now hold on, Ruth," interrupted Henry Patterson from the back of the room. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves with accusations." Mrs. Henderson's lips pursed with displeasure. "Mr. Patterson, the facts are clear. Mrs. Lanning has employed a man with a violent criminal past, exposing our children and community to unnecessary danger. As educators, we have a responsibility to maintain certain standards." "What standards?" called out Ben Chen, standing near the window with his wife beside him. "The standard that says a man can't defend an innocent child, the standard that protects the wealthy and punishes the righteous." A murmur of agreement rippled through part of the crowd, while others shifted uncomfortably. Cora realized with growing amazement that the community was more divided than she'd expected. Mrs. Commento Henderson's assumed moral authority wasn't as absolute as it had seemed. "Mrs. Lanning," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying forced patience, "perhaps you'd like to explain your decision to harbor this fugitive despite knowing about his violent past." Cora rose slowly, turning to face the crowd rather than the school board. These were her neighbors, her friends, people whose children she'd taught and whose families she'd known for decades. If she was going to make her case, it would be to them. "Wyatt Granger isn't a fugitive," she said clearly, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "Sheriff Morrison confirmed that no charges are pending against him. What he is a man who tried to save a little girl's life and has spent 11 years paying for that act of courage." "He's a killer," Mrs. Henderson countered. "Whatever his motivations, he took a life." "Yes, he did." Cora's voice didn't waver. "He killed a man who was torturing a child to death. He stopped a monster who'd been protected by money and influence, while innocent families suffered in silence." Mei Chen stepped forward from her place near the wall, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite her soft voice. "I would like to speak," she said. Mrs. Henderson looked flustered. "Mrs. Chen, this isn't really the proper forum. My sister died in that barn." Mei continued, her accent making each word precise and careful. "Lucy was 10 years old. She died afraid and alone, while grown men did nothing because they feared powerful family." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd like snow. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed at a loss for how to respond to such raw pain. "Mr. Wyatt tried to save her," Mei continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He was only one who had courage to fight for my little sister. You want to punish him for this? You want to drive away only man who stood up for innocent child?" "Nobody's trying to punish anyone," Mrs. Henderson said weakly. "Then what you call this?" May gestured around the packed room. "You gather like angry mob to drive away good man because you're afraid of truth, that sometimes good people must do hard things to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Jake Lanning appeared in the doorway, having slipped away from home despite being told to stay with Tommy. His young face was flushed with determination as he pushed through the crowd toward the front of the room. "Jake, you shouldn't be here," Cora said, but he shook his head stubbornly. Yes, I should. This is about my family too. He turned to face the crowd with the fearless directness that only children possessed. You all keep talking about Wyatt like he's some kind of monster, but none of you were there when our fence was falling down and our roof was leaking, and we didn't have enough food. None of you helped when Tommy was having nightmares every night, and I was trying to be the man of the house when I was just 12 years old. His voice cracked with emotion, but he pressed on. Wyatt came and fixed everything. He taught me how to work with tools, how to stand up for myself, how to take care of things without being angry all the time. He made Tommy laugh again. He made my mama smile again. The boy's eyes swept the room, landing on faces he'd known since birth. You want to take that away because you're scared of something that happened before I was even born? Because you think protecting a little girl makes him dangerous? Tommy's tear-stained drawing appeared in Jake's hand, the picture he'd made of their family that now included a tall figure standing protectively beside them. This is what Wyatt means to us, he said, holding up the paper for everyone to see. This is our family now, and if you make him leave, you're not protecting anybody. You're just breaking something that was finally getting fixed. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Tommy Chen sobbing quietly in his mother's arms and the rustle of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. In that moment, the moral complexity of the situation became impossible to ignore. Here was a child defending the man who'd given him back, his sense of safety, while another child grieved for the sister who'd died because no one else had been brave enough to intervene. The schoolhouse door opened with a quiet creak that somehow cut through the charged atmosphere more effectively than any shout. Wyatt Granger stepped inside, removing his hat with the same respectful gesture he used every morning when he greeted Cora. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Conversations died, people turned to stare, and even Mrs. Henderson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He wasn't a large man compared to some of the ranchers and farmers in the crowd, but something about his quiet composure commanded attention. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the packed room without any need to raise it. "Begging your pardon for the interruption," he said, his pale eyes taking in the scene with calm assessment. "But I understand you're having a discussion about my fitness to remain in this community." Mrs. Henderson recovered her voice first. "Mr. Granger, this is a private school board meeting. You have no right to be here." "Maybe not," Wyatt agreed mildly, "but since I'm the subject of discussion, seemed only fair I should have a chance to speak my piece." He moved slowly toward the front of the room, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. People instinctively stepped aside to create a path, though whether from fear or respect was impossible to determine. "I won't insult your intelligence by claiming I'm not a dangerous man," he said, settling his hat in his hands. "I've killed before, and in the right circumstances, I'd kill again. But I want you to understand something about those circumstances." From his shirt pocket, he withdrew a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked and soft, with age and handling. The sight of it seemed to surprise some in the crowd. They'd expected defiance or justification, not quiet faith. "This belonged to my mother," he said, opening it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "She taught me to read from it, taught me right from wrong, taught me that a man's character is measured by what he does when nobody's watching." He found the passage he was looking for and read aloud, his voice steady and clear. "Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked." Looking up from the book, he met the eyes of people throughout the room. "I've carried this Bible through 10 years in prison, through times when I wondered if God had forgotten about men like me. But I never stopped believing that protecting innocence is worth whatever price you have to pay." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the back wall. "I've spent the last 3 days investigating Mr. Granger's story," he announced. "Sent telegrams to Cedar Ridge, talked to people who were there when Lucy Chen died. Every detail checks out exactly as he told it." The sheriff's voice grew harder as he continued. "Marcus Whitfield was a predator who'd been protected by his family's wealth and influence. Multiple families had been paid to keep quiet about his crimes. Lucy Chen was just the first child who died because nobody with power was willing to stop him. That doesn't excuse vigilante justice, Mrs. Henderson protested, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Doesn't it? Morrison replied. When the law fails to protect the innocent, when justice can be bought and sold like any other commodity, what's a decent man supposed to do? Stand by and watch? Dr. Matthews, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. I've observed Mr. Granger's interactions with the Lanning family for weeks now. As a physician, I'm trained to recognize signs of trauma, abuse, fear. What I've seen instead is healing. Those boys have gone from withdrawn and angry to confident and secure. That doesn't happen around dangerous men. And what about the example we're setting? Demanded Mrs. Henderson. What message does it send to our children if we allow killers to walk freely among us? The message, said a new voice from the back of the room, is that sometimes good people have to do hard things to protect those who can't protect themselves. Everyone turned to see old Samuel Patterson, Henry's father, making his way slowly toward the front with the aid of his walking stick. At 83, he was one of the community's most respected elders, a man who'd helped found Hollow Bend and whose opinion carried weight with even the most stubborn residents. I fought in the war, he said, his voice crackling with age but strong with conviction. Killed men who were trying to kill me and my friends. Killed them to protect something bigger than myself, the idea that decent people should be able to live in peace. He stopped beside Wyatt, studying the younger man's face with eyes that had seen 8 decades of human nature. This man did the same thing, just in a different kind of war. The war that decent people fight every day against those who prey on the innocent. Turning to face the crowd, Patterson's voice grew stronger. Any of you who want to condemn him for protecting a child are welcome to explain to me how that makes you better people. The challenge hung in the air, and Cora realized that the tide was turning. What had started as Mrs. Henderson's attempt to force a simple choice had become something larger, a community, examining its own values, its own definition of justice and morality. Wyatt looked around the room one more time, his worn Bible still in his hands. I can't change what I've done, he said quietly. I can't bring back the man I killed, even though he deserved what he got. All I can do is try to live worthy of the second chance I've been given. His eyes found Cora's across the crowded room. Mrs. Lanning and her boys gave me that chance. They looked past what I'd been and saw what I might become. If this community decides I'm not welcome here, I'll respect that decision and move on. But I want you to know that the months I've spent here have been the best of my life, because for the first time in 11 years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The simple honesty in his words seemed to settle over the room like a benediction, and Cora knew that whatever vote was taken tonight, the real decision had already been made in the hearts of people who understood the difference between justice and judgment. 1 year later, the annual Hollow Bend Harvest Festival filled the town square with the sounds of laughter, fiddle music, and children's voices raised in delight. The autumn air carried the scent of apple cider and fresh-baked pies, while colorful bunting fluttered between the oak trees that had shaded generations of celebrations. Cora stood near the photography booth, smoothing Tommy's hair one final time before their family portrait. At 9 years old, he'd grown taller and more confident, his shy smile now coming easier and lasting longer. The wooden horse Wyatt had carved for him the previous year was tucked safely in his Pocetta talisman he still carried everywhere, though he no longer needed it for comfort. "Stop fussing, Mama," Jake said with the exaggerated patience of a 13-year-old who considered himself nearly grown. "We look fine." And they did look fine, Cora realized. Jake had shot up another 3 inches over the summer, his shoulders beginning to broaden with the promise of the man he would become. More importantly, the angry defensiveness that had defined him after Samuel's death had mellowed into quiet confidence. He still took his responsibilities seriously, but no longer carried the weight of the world on his young shoulders. "Mr. Peterson's ready for you," called the photographer, a traveling professional who visited Hollow Bend twice a year to document the community's milestones. Wyatt emerged from behind the camera setup where he'd been helping arrange the backdrop, his sleeves rolled up and his face relaxed in a way that still surprised Cora sometimes. The careful guardedness that had characterized his early months with them had gradually given way to something approaching genuine peace. They arranged themselves for the photograph, Cora seated in the center with Tommy beside her, Jake standing tall on her other side, and Wyatt positioned slightly behind them, his hand resting gently on Jake's shoulder. It was an unconventional family portrait by traditional standards, but it captured something true about who they'd become together. "Everyone hold still," Mr. Peterson instructed, disappearing beneath his camera's black cloth. "And try to think happy thoughts." Happy thoughts came easily these days. The homestead was thriving under Wyatt's careful management, with new shingles on the barn, a rebuilt chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that had produced more vegetables than they could use. Samuel's workshop was active again, filled with the sound of Wyatt teaching Jake advanced carpentry techniques while Tommy whittled nearby, creating an increasingly sophisticated menagerie of wooden animals. The flash powder ignited with a bright pop, capturing the moment for posterity. As they relaxed from their poses, Cora found herself thinking about all the smaller moments that had led to this gradual healing of wounds that had seemed permanent, the slow building of trust that had transformed strangers into family. "Mama, can we go see the pie judging?" Tommy asked, tugging on her skirt. "Mrs. Chen said she entered her apple cinnamon recipe." "Of course, sweetheart." They made their way through the festival crowd, stopping frequently to chat with neighbors and friends. The reception they received was warm and inclusive, a marked change from the suspicious glances and whispered conversations that had followed Wyatt's first months in town. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the heated school board meeting, it had taken time for people to reconcile their fears with reality. But gradually, as month followed month without incident, as they watched Wyatt's quiet contributions to the community, opinion had shifted. The turning point had come during the severe winter storm that struck in February. When the Kowalski's barn collapsed under heavy snow, trapping their prize breeding bull, it was Wyatt who'd organized the rescue effort. Working through the night in dangerous conditions, he'd not only saved the animal, but also prevented the family's financial ruin. After that, it became increasingly difficult to see him as anything other than what he'd always been, a good man who'd made a terrible choice in impossible circumstances. "Wyatt," called Dr. Matthews from across the square, waving them over to where he stood, judging the annual strongman competition. "We need you to settle a dispute about proper lifting technique." It was typical of how thoroughly Wyatt had been accepted into the community's fabric. His knowledge and skills were valued, his opinion sought, his presence taken for granted in the way that only happened when someone truly belonged. As evening approached and the festival began winding down, the family found themselves sitting together on a blanket near the edge of the celebration, watching Jake participate in the young men's wrestling matches while Tommy dozed against Cora's shoulder. "He's gotten good at that," Wyatt observed, noting Jake's improved technique as he grappled with boys his own age. "Good teacher," Cora replied, though they both knew Jake's confidence came from more than just wrestling lessons. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening sounds of a community at peace with itself. The fiddle music had given way to quiet conversations and the distant laughter of children, playing one last game before bedtime. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Cora asked suddenly, the question emerging from thoughts she hadn't realized she'd been having. Wyatt turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "Why would I want to leave?" "I don't know. For adventure, maybe. To see what else is out there." "I've seen what's out there," he said quietly. "Most of it's not as good as what's here." Tommy shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before settling more deeply against his mother's side. Across the square, Jake had won his match and was accepting congratulations from his opponents with the gracious sportsmanship Wyatt had taught him. "Samuel would be proud of them," Cora said, watching her sons with the bittersweet mixture of joy and loss that had become familiar over the past year. "He'd be proud of you too," Wyatt replied. "Takes courage to build something new while honoring what came before." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, acknowledging the delicate balance they'd all learned to maintain, respecting Samuel's memory while embracing the new family structure they'd created together. As they packed up their picnic and prepared to head home, Cora caught sight of their family portrait propped against Mr. Peterson's display case. Even from a distance, she could see the happiness captured in their faces, the sense of belonging that had taken root slowly but surely over the past year. Sometimes, she reflected, the most broken families did indeed find healing in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the most dangerous man in town really was the one who finally taught everyone how to feel safe again.